Welcome to the Will and Dave Show, where we talk about hard things, whether it's comfortable or not. We think those conversations are necessary and important. We think that having different opinions is crucial to a healthy discourse. So saddle up and enjoy the fireside chat.
Good evening, William. Happy February
evening,
the
Dave.
26th.
Yes. It's a lovely day in paradise.
Well,
Actually, no, really, it's like +6 outside today, so it was really nice.
so for those of us who live in the other south of the border, what's that in Fahrenheit? That's about
Warmish. Melting.
over freezing, so it'll be about like 34, 35-ish.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
give or
it's kinda
take.
Nice. It was colder
For
here,
for
but
us
it
this
was-
time of year, it was pretty balmy.
Yeah. The snow was melting then if you're about freezing.
Yeah, in the sunlight, it was melting quite a bit, actually. It was really good.
So before we get into the crazy world that we live in, because we do live in a crazy world, we should maybe mention our sponsors.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a conversation with one of our wonderful sponsors of this week, Mallory Smith, the owner of Northern Truss.
Mhm.
And he wants some work on the website, on his website. So I said,
Mhm.
I think that's going to cost you about a year and a half of the Will and Dave Show sponsorship. So, for those of you in the Fort St. John area, if you need any floor systems or if you need any roof systems, as in the trusses or floor joists or any of the, what's the word you use? The
accoutrement.
accoutrement.
We can also acquire sheet metal, posts, various other items related to those.
Right.
We don't necessarily make them, but we can supply them.
And you know the phone number where they can reach them?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Oh my
Normally
gosh.
we have a title card for this. We have a card that we throw up.
Yeah, but I don't.
Yeah, I don't call the shop. I'm at the shop.
You
I
should know
don't
these
know if I've
things.
ever called the shop in my entire employment there. I don't know if I've ever actually called the shop.
Well, if you Google Northern Trust Fort St. John, you'll find it.
I'm going to. No,
I got it.
I didn't know I had to.
I didn't give you the heads up. It's
That's right.
250-787-3033. So if you want to get floor systems or roof systems or anything in between, phone the fine folks at Northern Trust. They would be glad to help you.
We do really good sponsor spots. Our ad spots are legendary.
And the other sponsor for the show, I'm going to let you carry, since maybe you can stump me.
I can't, but our other sponsor would be Stitched by Susan. Stitched by Susan is a wonderful website, podcast, YouTube channel, and live show on Facebook, all about the wonderful world of quilting.
It's actually
She does
a live
everything.
show on YouTube, not Facebook, but that's okay.
Oh, is it? Okay, my
It's
apologies.
YouTube only, yes.
Here we go. But yes, live shows, quilting courses, all manner of things related to quilting can be found at stitchedbysusan.com.
She actually is relaxing right now as we speak, as she wrapped up her launch this afternoon at 4 of her course online. So she
Perfect.
is relaxing on the couch.
I'm glad. Hopefully she's not watching this.
Right. And if you would like to sponsor the show yourself, there's an easy way to do it. You can go to www.buymeacoffee.com, Will and Dave Show. And for the price of one American cup of coffee, $5, in Canada it's like 11. But for one small cup of coffee, you can support the show, and we'd appreciate it. But other than that, that's the hard stuff out of the way.
Yeah, that's the hard stuff. We have to talk about like global-sized conflicts and freedom and all sorts of other heavy, heavy topics.
All the things that we don't know a whole lot about.
I mean, yeah, we are, in the grand scheme of things, we are very non-knowledgeable. We are very lacking in knowledge of any depth.
Non-knowledgeable, lacking in knowledge. Would that make us the village idiot?
Yeah, we're smooth-brained.
Smooth. Oh, I like that. Smooth brain.
Yeah.
Which, being
Yeah,
on the
this-
topics that we're talking about, it's sort of hard, but it's true. They're not.
Well, yeah. There's nothing new that we can bring up. I mean, obviously, everyone has heard. We're going to start with the global conflict. Everyone's heard about what's happening in Ukraine, I'm assuming. If you haven't, how is this the way you're finding out? Really, rethink your life choices. But I'm assuming if you're watching this show, you know there is currently war in Ukraine, with Russia being the instigator of said war. The details are hard to iron out because they're coming from a bajillion different sources, and it's all coming very quickly. But this is a somewhat unique conflict in the sense that it is happening in this new digital age. And so we're seeing an unprecedented amount of content from on the ground and from people who think they're on the ground,
Right.
if that makes sense. Like, the amount of misinformation that's been slung around in the past week has been mind-boggling. The number of posts, planes flying over Kiev from a 4-year-old video. The amount of that stuff that's happening right now, in conjunction with actual footage from people at Ground Zero, is unprecedented as far as my knowledge goes. Like, what was the last major conflict? What was it? Gulf War II, the second Gulf War,
Probably, yeah.
that was this publicized,
Yes.
and that was, we didn't have nearly the technology for sharing video then that we do now.
That's true. It's true. It is interesting,
think-
when you look at the recent events, the occupation in Ottawa, the war in Ukraine, and again the amount of social media coverage of it. It was easier in Ottawa because as everybody was doing it, and it was live on the ground, so you could see it, from 8 angles, and know that it was actually true. It's still a bit harder in Ukraine, as all of it is recorded and uploaded, and so you don't know how accurate it is. And me being me, I have a healthy or unhealthy, what's the word I want?
Skepticism?
Yes, a skepticism of mainstream media
Mm-hmm.
and what they feed us, as historically recent history has made them hard to believe.
Yeah, I think mainstream media has
understatement?
always been no. I mean, especially given for us specifically as Canadians. Well, you're not a Canadian, but as an ex-Canadian, specifically right now, trust in our mainstream media is at an all-time low, and so people tend to put more stock in anecdotal social media than they do in
It's true.
any large-scale journalism. Which is, I mean, it's good that doubt is being cast on them, but at the same time, social media isn't necessarily a very reliable point of information.
No, although it was easier in Ottawa, as you had like a lot of live video at the front line of what was happening in Ottawa, so it was easier to believe it, I guess. As
Yeah.
It It was on the ground, it was live, and it was just raw footage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to argue that that was real or not, as
Yeah.
it just was a little bit
So
harder in Ukraine, I think, on that angle to look at it, if it's real or not. But
yeah, and I think that that leads us into kind of what we discussed the other day about how we want to talk about the conflict in Ukraine. Like, what insight could we, as a couple of dudes with our tiny little podcast, have on a conflict like that? And that's the
I'll
point that
give you a
we,
hint. Absolutely none.
yeah, we don't know Jack Diddley, but it does give us an opportunity to touch on something that we brought up in the past, which is media literacy,
Yes.
specifically internet literacy.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe I'm just too cynical, which is a distinct possibility.
No, I don't think so.
But seeing how many people come out of the woodwork to post about Ukraine, our thoughts and prayers are with Ukraine, praying for the people of Ukraine, or changing their profile pictures to something temporary, or any number of those things. Those feel hollow. They feel empty to me. They feel like someone being like, I know this awful thing is happening, but don't forget about me.
Right.
I'm still here. I'm important too. And like, I know that's probably not what people are thinking when they're making those posts.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. I don't think anyone is maliciously sitting there twirling their mustache being like, ha, 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 who cares about Ukraine? Focus on me.
Right.
Nobody's doing that. But I think that it doesn't do anything. I feel like there's actually, great example. There's a podcast that I love listening to called We Are Man Enough. It's hosted by Liz Plank, Justin Baldoni, and another gentleman whose name I can't remember. It's a wonderful podcast about masculinity in the modern age. It's very progressive. But what they decided to do is they stopped production of their podcast. They're like, hey, with what's happening in the world right now, we don't feel like it's a good idea to be clogging up your social media with posts about our podcast. So we're going to take a break from production. We're just going to focus on relaying news, and that's that. So they are making space within their digital real estate for news about Ukraine and for more important stuff, what they deem as more important stuff. That is, I think, a good example of a viable gesture on social media, is being like, hey, we're going to step back from social media so that more important stuff can come to the forefront, rather than just posting about it a whole bunch. Because if everybody's posting about it, everything just gets drowned in it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the posting about Ukraine is necessarily bad. It's certainly not ill-intentioned, I don't think, but I don't think it's helping anything.
Gotcha.
It's like one like equals one prayer. Your thoughts and prayers to Ukraine doesn't mean jack. I mean, someone from Ukraine might read it and it might warm their heart, but I think at this point, that's the least of their concerns, is what people on social media think about what's happening in their country.
I would agree with that. I think that there is a lot of well-meaning hearts in saying, I stand with Ukraine, or I'm praying for them, and nothing against that. It is, but for me, I would ask, so what are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Are you donating to Red Cross? Are you reaching out to the local Russian or Ukraine who are in your area and getting their ideas and their thoughts, etc., on the situation? Or are you reading an article on the internet, or are you watching a show on ABC, NBC, FOX, etc., and saying, "Ooh, I want to stand with Ukraine," or maybe I believe this, and again, that is where it's coming from. I think for all of us, we really need to have an idea of what are we going to do, and if it is,
there are things we can do, like you say, writing to politicians is a thing. Looking to people who have better knowledge is a thing, and that leads into the next point, which is just being careful what you post.
Yes, please.
Mindlessly sharing videos that may or may not be about the actual conflict in Ukraine. Like, it's not hard. I've spotted multiple videos come across my feed. Like, I made the comment about the one with planes over Kiev that was years old. We don't even know if that was actually Kiev, but it took all of 2 minutes or less on Google to reverse search the video
Yeah.
and find out that it's an old video and know that it's not from the current conflict. And so it means nothing. And so there's something to be said for sharing pertinent information about the crisis in Ukraine right now. But if you're going to share information about it, take a little bit of time. The least you can do, if you really care about what's happening in Ukraine,
Yes.
take a little bit of care, make sure that what you're sharing is actually factual, and then share it. And ask yourself if what you're sharing is going to contribute anything,
Right.
anything at all. Whether it is just spreading awareness, that can be contributing. But if you're going to do that, make sure that it is legitimate.
Right.
It's not that hard to put a little bit of effort into it and verify it.
We're going to move on a little bit here
Mhm.
as the news in Canada is still ongoing. It is not on the front page. It's still happening.
Yeah.
though.
And there's really nothing else we can say about that conflict. It's
And
That's
this
all we got.
morning I saw on Facebook, the originator of all great news, friend of mine on Facebook who posted this article about how the UN soldiers were the ones who were in Ottawa in the green uniforms who didn't have any insignia on the shoulders. And it's one of these articles that it's not true.
Mhm.
And yet it sounds like it's really awesome information because, hey, there's these officers on the ground in Ottawa who didn't have any insignia on the shoulders. Now, here's the thing. They had insignia. It was on the shoulders. It was green on green, so it was hard to see. So in a lot of the coverage,
Didn't
it wasn't obvious. And you and I, actually, we went and we looked for them. And they are police officers out of Hull, Quebec. And
yeah, they're ones out of Quebec, and they're the
Yeah.
the Ottawa Special Operations
Yeah.
Team, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took us. We did that live. We did that live in less than 5 minutes
and when you
on stream.
So if you look just a little bit, you'd realize that, hey, there were insignia. They're hard to read.
Mhm.
And no, I don't agree with what they did, except odds are it's not the UN.
There's
again,
plenty of awful things that happened in Ottawa. We don't have to make up more awful things.
right. Here's the thing, though, and I mentioned this last week, I believe, about the blurring of the line in between the reality and the conspiracy.
Mm.
So in Ottawa, there's an airfield. And on this airfield is a company who does aircraft maintenance for the UN.
Hmm.
They were working on airplanes for the UN as the protests were going on.
Hmm.
So circulating, and in this article it mentions them, are these UN aircraft in Ottawa at this airstrip. They were being worked on by this outfit in Ottawa, and magically here were soldiers in green uniforms with no insignia. Merge the two together, and the UN is in town with airplanes, and they brought the soldiers in.
Yeah.
There were airplanes there. That may be true. There were men there in uniforms, and the logos were hard to see. Also true. You do a little bit of research and you realize that, hey, it's a company who does maintenance on UN aircraft, so just maybe they're there for maintenance. You look at the shoulders of the officers, there are insignia there, it's just hard to see. So every once in a while, it takes a bit of research as there are some lines in there which are getting awfully close together.
Those are
Conspiracy. But it's not a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, those are the points where, and I'm not saying that confirmation bias rears its ugly head as if it's some sort of accusation that only people who believe in conspiracies or who draw those connections suffer from confirmation bias. I suffer from confirmation bias on a regular basis. But those instances, those instances are where it likes to rear its ugly head in the most extreme way, and that it's really easy to draw that connection, and
Right.
that little tiny leap doesn't seem so big when it's reinforcing an idea that is already being pushed by various outlets.
That's true. Speaking of the truckers,
Yes.
how are things up in your neck of the woods? Are you hearing anything?
I mean, most of what I hear right now is, well, I think when we talked last week, the Emergencies Act had been enacted.
Yes.
It hadn't been voted on yet. Over the
Right.
course of this week, the House of Parliament voted on it and voted to keep it and extend it for another 30 days. And then while it was in deliberation in the Senate, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revoked it and revoked the emergency powers that he had garnered by enacting the Emergencies Act.
Right.
So there's a lot of, I mean, there's a certain amount of relief because that's kind of a best case scenario, I guess, for considering where we were at in that situation. I think that's kind of a best case scenario, is that he just revoked it of his own free will, which is not something we suspected he would do. The Canadian government doesn't really have a good track record of consolidating power in emergencies and then handing it back
Right.
when the emergency's over. They tend to like to hang on to it just in case.
Just in case there's more angry truckers somewhere.
It's one of those things where they haven't done anything bad with it that we know of yet, but who's to say they
Well-
couldn't? And we were kind of worried that the Emergencies Act would end up like that. Something where they take the power and hold on to it just in case.
Well, there are some bank accounts which were frozen.
Yes, that's something that that's a good example of something that's really hard to nail down as just a lone dude in my chair. There are tons of anecdotal and second, third party reports of people having their accounts frozen. But as far as we can confirm, there were only, I think, a few dozen accounts total that were frozen in its entirety, and almost all of them were larger up the pipeline of the truckers, their leadership,
Right.
and some of the trucks involved. I think there were around 2 dozen, I think,
I'm not sure, to be honest.
insurance policies that were pulled, so various truckers couldn't drive their trucks as they were driving without insurance. A couple of instances like that.
One
Like,
of them
I'm
will
not.
actually be on next week. So
Yes, so I don't want to minimize what happened there. I'm just saying that take all the claims of bank accounts being frozen with a grain of salt, because we only have confirmation that so many have happened. That's not to say that only so many did happen, but those are the only ones that we can confirm were because of that. I'm sure people have had their bank accounts frozen that were involved in the trucking in the protest, who think that it may have been the government, but who
Right.
knows? I'm not sure. So it's hard to speak to the absolute validity of all those claims.
this leads us into the meat of the show this week. Freedom and what is it?
Yeah.
And I've been really, I've been working this one over all week, as you mentioned it earlier this week.
Mhm.
Actually,
It was last week,
you
actually.
mentioned it,
Before
yeah.
before we had just gone, we were going to talk about this, but then we had the opportunity to have Jessica on,
Right.
and so we took it, obviously, because we really wanted to have her on, especially while her visit was so fresh in her head.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Is our rights and freedoms, are they the same thing?
Give me half a second to answer that. I first want to quickly touch on the comment from Kyle.
Okay.
He fact checked me, and I appreciate that. Government has stated that it was 210 accounts that were affected, or that they imposed some level of action on.
Gotcha.
I'm going to assume that action being freezing them until their demands have been met. And he included a source, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, but the source is CBC. Do we trust CBC?
Not particularly,
Sorry, Kyle,
but
just had to bug you.
it is a source.
It is.
So
a
he's already
source.
doing more than most people
Yes.
on social media.
Yes.
That's how low the bar is right now.
Isn't that the truth? That's how low the bar
But
is.
yeah, so rights and freedoms. You think is there a difference between rights and freedoms?
Yes. Is there a difference?
Well, I think that depends on what kind of rights we're talking about. Like, are we talking fundamental, like human rights?
Yeah.
So I feel like fundamental human rights are a broader topic or broader set of ideas or ideals from freedoms. I feel like freedoms are things that are provided, whereas
question.
human rights are something that should be baseline.
So where do we get them from? I had this conversation this afternoon with a gentleman here. We had this conversation about rights and freedoms. And
I think that most human rights, to a certain degree, follow a template of a moral compass, to a certain degree at least, which many people will argue is a God-given thing. Myself might differ with that opinion, but the fact remains that it's mostly the ability to do what you will with your own body.
I don't think that that's a God-given thing.
No, but I mean, as far as your influence goes, what other people can do to you is more of a matter of legality and rights, or freedoms. But I feel like rights are large, or yeah, I feel like rights are to a certain extent a personal thing. Until you get into things like the more political topics these days, where is running water a human right? Is internet access a human right? Is
Is
electricity
healthcare.
access a human right? Is healthcare a human right? Things like that. That's more modern, a more modern aspect to it. So I'm
Here's where
assuming you're
this
leading
came
into
from.
something.
Yes and no, because I think that there is a real difference. I think we have freedoms which are which are limited freedoms. If we look at Ottawa and what happened in Ottawa, and everybody is saying, I want my freedom back. I want freedom. I want freedom. I don't know that there is a right for freedom as a universal right. I think it's in the Constitution, or in Canada it's in the Bill of Rights. You're still muted, Will. It's in the
Our charter.
right. But all of those really are handed over, or they're written at the beginning of a country in the U.S.
Mhm.
Founding fathers, not mothers,
Yep.
which always has amazed me. Maybe if there were ladies involved, it would have been a gentler document. But there's a document in which it says, here are our rights, and we believe in these rights.
Mhm.
There was some argument as to those rights. If you had asked England and King George,
Mhm.
there was an argument of whose rights they were, and if we were to have them. And yet, I believe in freedom and I believe in rights,
Mhm.
but I don't know that they're universal, and I don't know that they won't change over time.
Yes. I think that them changing over time is, I don't know if it's changing over time is inherently a good thing, but them being assessed over time, I think is a necessary thing. I think we need to. I don't think that we can just have like such a hard guideline for society and life and not reassess it. Because what was an immutable right, say 100 years ago, might not be the same now. Times have changed a lot in 100 years.
But how have those rights
I don't
changed?
know. Things like, I look at to use an example that I have kind of gray feelings about, the right to bear arms. That was meant to be a way for a militia to rise up in the case of a government becoming corrupt. That way, the people had the ability to rise up and defend themselves and
Right.
to push back against a corrupt government. But the fact of the matter is that in this day and age, that doesn't translate the same way. It used to be that everybody had muskets. It didn't matter if you were a prince, a king, or a dude with a farm, you got a musket or maybe a cannon. Whereas
Right.
nowadays, the discrepancy in firearms is so vast that a person's right to carry a firearm doesn't translate as much. If a government wants to force you to do things, there's nothing that a dude with a gun can do to stop it.
Right.
That gap is too big, and so those laws, I'm not saying they're bad or defunct. I'm just saying that we can reassess them and see, is there any way that we can look at that differently that might make it, is the cost of everyone having firearms as a right as opposed to a privilege worth whatever peace of mind it may give us. This is a really like off the cuff example. That's a very
Yeah.
deep topic that I don't want to dive into too deep tonight. Um,
But it's a good example of, for
it
Americans for
changes.
sure, that
Yeah.
it's my right to bear arms.
Yeah.
And it's a right which was given in the Constitution. And can I agree with
Hmm.
that? It's, it is there. But I don't
Or
know I agree that it's God given
yeah.
because he didn't say anywhere in the Bible that, hey, you need the right to arm yourself.
Yeah. Or to use, I think, maybe a better example, let's use marriage as an example. When those laws were written, marriage was very hard line. There was only one way to do it, only one kind of marriage, and that was it. That was all. Um, Times have changed. Gay marriage is a much more widely accepted thing, that it is a valid and acceptable way of living, not just acceptable, but totally normal. And so to have laws that still, I don't want to say discriminate, that's a little bit still harsh of a word for where we're at right now, at least in Canada, but that separate married gay couples from married heterosexual couples. The times have changed. We can adjust laws to fit, as we have been adjusting laws, where laws used to dictate that only a man and a woman could be married. We have adjusted because our understanding of ourselves as a species has changed over the decades.
Let's get to this one. Are you reading it there?
It's supposed to be difficult. Like the Society Act, the charter is supposed to be difficult to change. That way, the people have the ability to challenge a corrupt government. Yes, I think they should be difficult to change. It's, I don't know how best to tackle the subject. It's such a very prickly subject. Um,
Okay, I like that, Doug. That's good.
it's so the thing. So I'm kind of gonna hijack this a little bit, and hopefully I can turn this back around because I don't know how best to tackle that. Something that's been weighing on me, and it was actually brought up in the comment section a few weeks ago by one of our more regular viewers recently and commenters, True Swans. We know you and love you. They brought up how abortion fits into all of this talk about people's freedom and bodily autonomy. And that's something that's been weighing heavily on me is we talk about freedom, we talk about bodily autonomy, our freedom to govern ourselves and our own bodies the way we wish, but we seem to only be talking about that in when it comes to this medication. But where do, like, if we apply that same logic, the same absolute autonomy with what you put in your own body, or what the government can do to your body or dictate you do with your body, where does abortion fit into that? It's something I've been wrestling with because it's a really good point. Like, there's a pretty solid parallel between my arguments for why a person should get vaccinated, not because it protects them only, but because it protects the people around them. Whereas if someone wants to have an abortion, the common pushback for people who are pro-life as opposed to pro-choice is that it's not just their choice; it's also affecting the life that's the potential life that's growing inside of them. But it's still their body. It doesn't matter what other lives are connected to it. It's their body. That is the point. That is the point where the freedom of choice starts, and that's where it ends too. That's where the buck stops and starts. And I want to see, as we have this conversation kind of as a country about freedoms and bodily autonomy, if we're going to have that conversation, I want to see it. I want to see that conversation spread. I don't want it to just be about these mandates. If we're going to have this heavy conversation, I think that it should apply to a bunch of other areas like that.
And that's a deeper topic, which
Yeah. I don't
is
want to get
on our list of tackling, although it won't be you and I talking about it. So
Yeah, we would need to have somebody with more firsthand experience in here to talk about it. Probably
Uh,
someone with a uterus would be the first criteria.
I'm going to table that conversation for another day.
Yeah.
Although it is a good,
But
it's a
yeah,
good example.
I don't want to
But
get dragged into the mire of pro-choice versus pro-life.
Right.
But I just want to use it as an example that we seem to be hung up on only talking about it in regards to this vaccine mandate. But if we're so passionate about freedom and complete bodily autonomy, I think we also need to assess how we feel about abortion, how we feel about marriage, how we feel about concepts like polyamory. Who are we to judge who a person is or isn't married to, or lives with, or sleeps with, or loves? Like, I feel like those are all to a certain extent interconnected. And if we're kind of collectively saying as a country that, hey, my body, my choice, does that carry through? Do we want it to carry through? Do we not want it to carry through?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on our point of reference.
Right.
For many of us, our rights and our freedoms really, they are viewed through your lens and through my lens, and they're completely different.
Mhm.
And those are the hard parts. When you look at Ottawa, there's a whole government and obviously a whole bunch of policemen who
Mhm.
said you don't have any rights here.
In
We're
this
removing
particular
those
aspect,
rights
yeah.
in this aspect. And there are those, there's a lot of us who say, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, we do have rights.
Mhm.
So these, so the rights are very, they are linked into
Mhm.
our viewpoint and our perspective.
Yes.
So when you zoom out a little bit, again, you look at the reasons for the, the rights and the freedoms. For me, I go, or I try to go into my faith and say, okay, are the rights and freedoms in the Bible?
Right.
There's not a lot of example of rights in the Bible.
No, slavery was a thing.
Yeah, it was a condoned thing. It was
Yeah.
accepted, and so we say, well, we have the right to be free. Well, that's not a scriptural thing. It is not a biblical thing. It is
Yeah.
a human thing. When I look at the right to life,
Mhm.
I do believe in the right to life. I do believe all of us have a right to live.
Mhm.
There's not a whole lot of grounds in the Bible for saying, if you don't let me live, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
It,
Not to I don't want to sound like I'm bashing the Bible as I'm throwing these examples out, but there's examples of God instructing people who
yes,
listen to him to kill men, women, and children. I don't
yes.
feel like life being a freedom was a particularly big touchstone.
And when you look at the New Testament and you look at the life of Jesus,
Mhm.
his was not a life of saying, you know, you know, here are the freedoms, here are your rights, and you have to fight for them.
Mhm.
He died in support of the rights, and he died willingly in support of rights and freedoms. He felt it was more important that you not fight.
Mhm.
And I think and often on the right, you find the evangelicals and you find the people, and they say, it's my God given right. I don't think that they're God given. I agree with them.
Yeah.
With a lot of those rights, I agree with the rights. I don't know that they are God given, and I believe they will change over time. Exactly.
Yeah. I I absolutely agree with that.
If you go back in history, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to record that, Will, that you agree with me. Absolutely.
No,
Oh my gosh.
I unequivocally agree with that.
Like
That
no caveats, no nothing.
no,
Oh, come
we
on.
gave ourselves those rights. Nothing in the good book dictated those rights specifically. We may have extrapolated those rights from teachings in the good book and mold those into what we define as our rights, but we are the ones who designed and granted them to ourselves effectively.
Yes. Again, that's not a bad thing, and I don't want to
Yeah.
like I honestly, it's how to word this. I think acknowledging the fact that here are the rights I believe in, and I believe in them as law. You know, you know,
Mhm.
here in the Constitution in Canada, the Bill of Rights, or
Mhm.
whatever you have up there, the Charter of Rights and
Charter.
Freedoms,
Yeah.
and absolutely they're hard to change.
Mhm.
Here's where I believe, as everybody, get your ass out and vote.
Yeah.
If you want to make any change, vote for change.
Mhm.
And I believe in Canada, what you're seeing is a whole bunch of people who voted for change And right about now, they're not happy with what that r- resulted in.
Yeah, it honestly, I don't think it was much change. It was a change of a coat of paint. But I see a parallel between a lot of what progressive people complained about with Harper, where he did things unilaterally without any kind of voting. He made social policies that were not the will of the people because it benefited the government and it benefited what he viewed as the will of the people. And what we're seeing now is a liberal government that said they wouldn't be like that and are doing exactly that. It's a new coat of paint. It's a very woke, very, very hey, that's actually the best term I think I can give for it. It's a very woke take on it, but it's still the same thing where the government issues its own authority over the will of the people.
Yes.
And I want to throw up that last comment from Murray Whitmer. We all need to educate ourselves on the premise of each party and vote wisely. I want to point that out because currently, like looking at the current parties that we have available, and if there were to be a federal election tomorrow, I don't know if I could bring myself to vote for any of them with a clear conscience.
Why
Because
not?
because currently they're all kind of crap.
Yeah, but you got to vote for one of them.
I know.
You know
That's
what the liberals do.
it's trying to find the shiniest of three turds right now
Well,
because the Green
5 or
Party just
6
doesn't really
turds.
count. I don't count the Green Party or the People's Party or the Bloc Québécois because I live in Western Canada and it's kind of an irrelevant vote right now. If I in Western Canada was voting for Bloc, I need to reassess my priorities. Not because the Bloc is inherently bad, but because
Here's an idea. Why doesn't everybody vote for the bloc, and then you can split off into 3 different countries? Go
that'd
for
be
Western
awful.
Canada, go for Eastern Canada, and Quebec.
That'd be awful.
Well, is it worse than what the liberals have done to you?
I don't know. See, there's a genuine fear of mine that something like that could happen. I don't know. We on the West Coast rely on the East Coast for so many things in terms of like federal funding and all this stuff, but the East Coast relies on the West Coast for such an absurd amount of money that it's laughable.
Yes.
The amount that we pay in, what are they called again? Equalization payments.
Yes.
So we pay them lots of money and they give us lots of money back. I have to wonder sometimes if Western Canada would function better as its own, you know, its own entity. But then we wouldn't have Canada. Then we'd have two different entities, and for good or for worse,
So
they'd
there
be
are
two different
5 of
things.
you watching in the chat. Here is my question for the 5 of you. I would love it if you could chime in on here.
Hmm.
So we know who the liberals are. Like they have shown their colors in this really for the last year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
We now know who the NDP is, which is weak-kneed and spineless. Have a little bit of idea of the lack of leadership in the Conservative Party.
Mm-hmm.
I have more respect right now for the Bloc than I do of anybody else.
I know, right? It's a weird world.
Who do you vote for in the next election? As I'm not a fan of Candice Bergen, as I watched her like a day after her nomination as the leader, and she got up in Parliament and said, okay, we've heard you truckers, it's time to go home. Not the smartest move on her part. I want to know who wrote that for her. Who do you vote for in the next election? Because there's going to be election. You know there's going to be.
I don't understand, like, why, how hard would it have been for a Candice Bergen to go talk to the organizers of the trucker rally? How hard could it be to get your security detail, go down there and say howdy doody and have a chat with them? You don't even have to do anything. Just show up. That would have been the best press she could have ever had.
Yes, it would have been.
That would have been the easiest free votes any politician's ever gotten if she just showed up. I genuinely don't understand how people can't take a protest like that seriously. They took it seriously, but they took it seriously the wrong way. They took it like an affront, like a threat, and it was never meant to be a threat. There were fringe people who did threatening things, yes, like that can't be ignored, but that doesn't reflect on the entirety of the group. And I don't understand. I can't wrap my head around how nobody thought or thought hard enough to do that. Or or I would love to know the rationale behind why they didn't do it, but they don't tell us. A Candace Bergen even doesn't come out and say, well, no, we had reasons for not doing it. They just shut up and clam up.
It is interesting. And we look at Canada as sort of as a voice for freedom and a voice for tolerance, as they are more liberal than the U.S. obviously, and so we look for this sort of hippie-ish sort of where it's okay. It's not okay to do what the Liberal Party did.
Mm-hmm.
It has to cost them in the next election.
Mm-hmm.
It is not okay to do what the NDP party did. I hope it costs them in the next election.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to.
So who does that leave? There's no
I
leadership
don't
in the
know.
Conservative Party.
Not proper leadership.
Now, I am a fan of the PPC. I think it's actually a pretty cool party. I'm not a fan of the leadership, but I'm a fan of
Yeah, that's a good point. They're boots on the ground membership, like the gentleman who is running here. From what I know, I don't know if I've actually met the guy in person.
For the PPC.
He seems like a really genuinely nice person, but yeah, the leadership, Bernier, is kind of an asshat.
But when you look at the parties in Canada, again, we should look at a couple of these.
Yeah, that comes back to picking the shiniest of however many turds are running. That's all this election seems to be coming down to, is rather than picking a good one, you pick the least crappy one.
I agree with Kyle on this one. And it seems interesting in Canada, the role of government in these events is historically is heavy-handed.
I think Kyle brings up a really good point, that right now on this particular specific issue, government seems to be strangely divided. There are obviously MPs and smaller politicians that are voicing support.
Right.
But amongst the political leadership, there seems to be kind of universal disdain for the protest. And it does make one wonder, because that's strange. You would think that one of these parties would capitalize on the unrest, on the displeasure of these people that are protesting, to try and ingratiate themselves with that group. It's strange that nobody's capitalizing on that. On top of my frustration on nobody doing it, is I scratch my head wondering why nobody thought to.
It's interesting. Okay, it just as you were talking about that, I remember the days of the Reform Party in Canada, and all the years for the Reform Party and Preston Manning, and I loved his ideals. Like, I thought he was a good man. I thought he was a politician, but he was a good man. He could never make it, and the only way they made it was they merged with the Conservative Party, and they became the righter one in Canada. He couldn't lead it. He had to hand it over the year they were elected to Harper. But it was a merging of the parties, and it is and I wonder if you don't see a merger of parties again in light of what has happened with the Liberal and the NDP.
I don't know. I really firmly hope that the NDP doesn't merge with the Liberal Party. But at this point, they're kind of different sides of the same coin, where the Liberal Party preaches, well, no, they're same sides of the same coin. They both preach this wonderful progressive mantra and these wonderful progressive ideas that I want to see fleshed out and I want to see realized, but they're toothless. Both parties are just spineless and toothless right now. And it frustrates me. It frustrates me so much because I had such high hopes, specifically for the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, that have just been dashed. I mean, you and I were talking on the phone about his. So the NDP voted in favor of extending the Emergencies Act, which I was very bummed out about because I thought they would push back on it. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place, admittedly, with Justin Trudeau basically saying that any vote against his wanting to extend the act would be a vote of no confidence, which strong armed people both within his own party and outside of his party into following and getting in line. So Jagmeet's kind of like NDP is kind of in a tough spot where they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. But I had really hoped that they would take the route that said they stood for something, regardless, because I don't think it was going to change the outcome really,
So let me
which way
ask
they
you a
voted.
question. Why were they damned if they didn't?
If they voted against it, I feel like a good chunk, because the NDP tends to be more progressive than the Liberal Party, and a lot of people in that camp that I know were still pretty upset about the Freedom Convoy in the first place. I think most people were upset with how Ottawa was handling things, but a lot of people didn't like that the convoy existed in the first place. And
Yeah,
so
but
if
he would have
he,
gotten a lot of Liberal votes over that.
that's the thing, is he held on to those votes, but he cost himself other votes. And I think that the balance was off. I think he took the wrong option. I still think that he's going to lose votes either way, but I think he lost more doing what he did. I think he lost more confidence in his party's ability to
Absolutely.
stick up. So I think it was a rock and a hard place, but I think he picked the wrong one. He jumped out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak.
I think all the leaders all made huge mistakes in
Here
this.
they all kind of shat the bed.
And I believe if you are the Conservatives, I think you make a deal with PPC or one of the other parties and say, why don't we? Here's our
I mean,
opportunity.
that's what they did in BC. Just pull a BC.
Yeah.
Just do that. For those of you who are listening who are not from Canada, in the last provincial election in BC, the Conservative Party had technically won by I think one seat, but the NDP effectively merged with the Green Party, who had I think only 2 seats, 2 or 3. It was a very, very narrow margin, and they basically yoinked the election out from under the Conservatives. Which, I mean, I voted NDP, or sorry, would have voted NDP if I was living in BC at the time, but I still think that was underhanded. I don't think that's a very good approximation of democracy.
Oh, the joys of minority governments. That's
I
how
know.
your leader got elected. And you're exactly right on this one, Doug. They had their hand out, and I believe that he's going to get his hand filled with a whole bunch of those poop
He's gonna
emojis.
well, he's gonna get at least entertained on some of his cool ideas, like drinking water for reserves and things like that, which shouldn't be novel ideas to begin with, but here we are.
Well, Will, we wanted to hit on the freedoms and the rights, and we sort of we scratched the top of the.
It's kind of a bottomless well to talk about. It's such a magnanimous topic.
Here's my line for rights and freedoms. Few of them are universal, I believe. Few of our rights are universal, and very few of our freedoms are universal. I was reading. Hold on to your hat. I was reading my Bible the other day in preparation of this, and I was looking for how universal are our freedoms, and they're not universal. Is almost always it has a caveat. Use your freedoms, but in the freedoms you're using, you need to be careful with how you use your freedoms. They always are given a caveat and saying use them wisely, as if you abuse them, you're not free. And I believe in the noise of I want my freedoms, we lose a little bit of the fact that yes, we want our freedoms, but how are you going to use them? Are you going to use them for you or for those around you?
Right.
And I think we need to be very careful when we say, I want my freedom, I want my rights.
I
Make
think
sure you know what you're asking for.
there's a term that gets thrown around when it comes to supporting the military a lot, and it's that freedom isn't free, right? It costs to get the freedom that we have.
It's a good
But
one.
I think it can be extended further to say that freedom still isn't free. With that freedom comes responsibility. There's a social contract that we all take on when we get to enjoy these freedoms.
Right.
Freedom doesn't mean without cost. Doesn't mean it's
That's right.
just static. It's something that we all have to pay into as well as a society.
And I agree with Murray. We have the freedom to do lots of things, but it's not always expedient, and it is not always the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that. I think that we do have the freedom to do almost anything, but there are consequences.
Yeah.
For some of the things that we do, and it just is a part of. It's a part of living with other people,
Mm-hmm.
and in the world that we live in, I think that our rights and our freedoms need to be cautiously guarded, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyways, William, this has been a bit of an easier night in a way.
I mean, it's heavy.
It is
It's
heavy.
easy in the sense that it didn't have a lot of necessarily a ton of like prep work or slides or clips,
Right.
but we had to exercise our brains a fair bit tonight
Yes.
and wrestle with some hefty topics. So heavy topic stock.
And you absolutely agreed with me on something, which I'm going to
I
go
did.
back and I'm going to record that. I'm just
You clip
record
it.
you saying that, and that's going to be a ringtone on my phone.
I think you're absolutely right, Dad. Must be Will.
Other than that, I believe that next week we will have a member of the convoy on
we
this
will.
show.
We will.
So we'd love to see you and your friends watching us next week.
Mhm.
Live.
Fill
if
that
you
comment
can,
section with good questions.
because it's always
We
way
can
more
only come
fun
up with so many.
live. Way more
Yeah.
fun live. William, you have anything neat to say to our viewers before we wrap this thing up?
I do. Stay safe. Don't die. Have a good night.